Do I need to introduce Max Blumenthal? He's only the finest journalist in the West, and his outfit, Grey Zone News, is only the best outfit. He is a frequent commentator here on the mother of all talk shows, for which we are all grateful and enriched. Max, welcome back to the show. As Lewis Carroll said, will he join the dance? Is Trump going to go ahead with this or not?
Well, if he doesn't, Israel is in a very, very precarious position. And that's why I think he must. And that Trump is not the one actually executing the decision, that he has handed over control of the reins of this policy to dark neoconservative and Likudnik forces. But let's consider just the timeline that Trump has laid out. He said, what was it, 3 days ago, that there was a 10-day timeline for negotiation. And we keep hearing all these positive reports. Just most recently, maybe 2 hours ago, from the Omani foreign minister, that Iran and the U.S. have reached various understandings. But Israel's not part of that understanding, and Israel will not allow an understanding. And I'll explain why in a second, but just to remain focused on the timeline. 10 days from when Trump outlined his timeline would have been the Jewish holiday of Purim, which Jews celebrate very differently all around the world. But inside Israel, it's part of this national kind of season of indoctrination. And the way they understand it is, that is when the Persian king, Haman, was toppled and destroyed because of his plot to eradicate the Jews. And so it's seen almost as an anti-Iranian holiday, or interpreted that way through the Zionist indoctrination system in Israel. So it feels very much like this timeline was provided to Trump by the Israelis. They're also seeking to attack during Ramadan, which, as a member of Knesset recently said, is the period when Muslims are at their weakest. There is no chance that I can see for Netanyahu to get this level of deployment and force posture from the U.S. military, which he has effectively rented out through the millions and millions of dollars Miriam Adelson, his cutout, has donated to Donald Trump, again in the Trump administration. This will not happen again. Why? First of all, let's not even go as far as congressional midterms. FIFA's coming up, the World Cup in the United States. Do you think that Trump is going to launch another attack in June, or want to be at war in June still? No, the U.S. thinks that it can do a very rapid fire war like we just saw in Venezuela, where it destroys the enemy's communication systems and defenses very rapidly, and then the enemy capitulates and either agrees to its terms or its regime change. So they're trying to get that certainly by June. And then after that, you have the congressional midterms, in which Trump is probably going to take, and his MAGA coalition will take, a massive thumping. He's underwater. He's at historically low approval ratings right now. So Netanyahu has this one moment to get it done through Trump, a president he exerts more influence over than any other U.S. president. And this is it. And what will happen if Trump actually stands down after sending 2 U.S. aircraft carrier battle groups and more aerial assets, naval assets, than in any time since the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq? The Israel lobby will be furious. Miriam Adelson will be furious. And just today, George, something happened that I think a lot of people aren't taking into consideration in connection with Donald Trump's motivations and his thinking on Iran, which is deeply disturbing, which is that a man with a shotgun and a gas canister penetrated the security perimeter at his Mar-a-Lago estate and was killed by Secret Service. This, I think, affects Donald Trump's thinking, and he wonders if he will be personally secure if he infuriates the forces of Greater Israel that have effectively gotten him by the short and curlies.
And speaking of those, what did you make of Tucker Carlson's epic interview with probably the most unhinged ambassador the United States has ever had, during which, inter alia, he effectively declared support for any future Israeli wars to take what God promised them: a piece of Egypt, a piece of Jordan, all of Jordan actually, which is currently hosting significant US forces for the attack on Iran, Lebanon, a piece of Saudi Arabia, and right up to the Euphrates River in Iraq. This interview that Tucker has elicited from this fool Huckabee, who has not been repudiated by Donald Trump, who is not the subject of a sacking or any resignation from any State Department diplomat or official, has informed the Arab countries in the US coalition exactly what these neocons have in mind for them. What about Huckabee? What about Tucker?
Well, if the Nobel Peace Prize were not actually now the Nobel War Prize, Tucker would deserve it just for his efforts alone here and for the price he exacted on the warmongers. Tucker Carlson did something that no major U.S. journalist has been willing to do, which is to not only challenge the policy, but to challenge and expose the contradictions and hollowness and sheer insanity of the ideology behind it. That's not just the Christian Zionist ideology of Mike Huckabee, which really is nothing more than a more extreme iteration of the Zionist ideology that animates the Trump administration. It's the Zionist ideology itself. And that's what I think was so brilliant about Tucker Carlson's approach here, was that he went in determined to expose the Christian Zionist and Zionist ideology as something that cannot actually be defended through any rational terms, which is too filled with contradictions to even make sense to the average person. And Mike Huckabee went into contortions and eventually collapsed. And Mike Huckabee is the probably most powerful and well-known living symbol or embodiment of Christian Zionist ideology. And it all fell apart on the question of land and the reality of the policy that the U.S. is supposed to enforce in the region, which historically, going back to Eisenhower, has been that there should, that there should be some Palestinian autonomy and Arab autonomy as well. And what Huckabee said was, no, because of this book, this ancient book, and this sky god, the Jews can have any land they want between the Nile and the Euphrates because that's what the Bible said. And that caused a massive diplomatic incident, which prompted all of the Arab vassal states that normally bow down before the U.S., Saudi Arabia, which just honored Israel's favorite general, the former CENTCOM commander, Michael Kurilla, Jordan, which is hosting U.S. anti-missile systems deployed against Iran, to actually issue this statement condemning the U.S. ambassador, something we've never seen before. And this was all because Tucker simply went to Israel and behaved like an actual journalist and asked these critical questions. I should also mention the first question that Tucker Carlson asked was, why did you secretly meet with Israeli mega spy, convicted traitor to the U.S., Jonathan Pollard, in secret at your embassy? And Huckabee's first answer was to lie. He straight up lied and insinuated that he'd only met Jonathan Pollard twice in the past, just in passing at hotels. The truth was Huckabee had come to Jerusalem starting in 2011 to campaign for Pollard's release, and that they met in private without notifying anyone according to diplomatic protocol that he was meeting with this spy who's still very active in Israeli politics and national security at a dangerous level. And so Huckabee lies, but then what he said to Tucker I thought was so remarkable. He said, you're actually the first journalist to ask me about that meeting with Jonathan Pollard. I mean, it was reported in the New York Times, but since then, no one's asked him about it. So where the hell is the rest of the U.S. media to conduct these interviews, to ask these questions, to even pressure Trump? I mean, you look at the White House briefings, there's no pressure, there's no antagonism or adversarial confrontation about the fact that the U.S. is about to ignite a regional war on behalf of Israel. And so Tucker is really just the one journalist doing his job, and he caused a major diplomatic confrontation that might have actually complicated that war.
Well, yes. I mean, in the wake of Huckabee's unrepudiated statements, I stress that Trump hasn't denounced what he said or contradicted it. So at this point, it is extant as American diplomatic policy, if unstated by anyone other than their ambassador to Israel. But for example, Saudi Arabia, how do they support an American attack on Iran when the US embassy in Tel Aviv or in Jerusalem even has just informed them that Israel is fully entitled to take a part of their country? It really acutely embarrasses the Sunni Muslim Arab states, doesn't it?
Well, absolutely. I mean, this is just what's one humiliation after another for them, but what can they do? What kind of leverage can they have? What kind of leverage does Turkey have to push back? I know they don't want this war. I mean, it's right on their border. It's going to be massively destabilizing. But what can they do as a NATO member? What can they do when they're, you have 5 major families who control the construction industry and have financial ties to Tel Aviv that are based in Istanbul? I mean, I put this question to people in the region who have connections to those governments, and they really don't have any leverage. What leverage does Iran have? Well, it has a revolutionary system that is existing almost against its own will outside of the financial infrastructure which we see and the networks that we see articulated and exposed through the Epstein emails. I mean, who is Jeffrey Epstein meeting with? You constantly hear this phrase, the Epstein class now. Who is he meeting with so often at his townhouse in New York when there is a UN General Assembly? He'd say, well, I'm going to have the Qataris over, and then my friend Suleiman from the United Arab Emirates is coming over, and he's meeting with the Saudis, and he's then, surrounded by Zionists, Jewish Zionists. So that's the Epstein class, and Iran exists outside of it. And what leverage does Iran have? It has ballistic missiles. It has a now civilian nuclear program with potential breakout capacity, and it's willing to use it to defend its revolutionary system. None of these other countries will do so. So the best we get from them is a strongly worded statement, which I think the US and Israel will disregard in their war planning. However, Saudi Arabia does understand, and some of these other Sunni states do understand, that Israel as a regional hegemon, if it is able to somehow overpower Iran and get regime change, that they will be next. There's not going to be an alliance of equals within the Abraham Accords, or what we could call the Epstein Accords. They will be treated as vassals and junior partners, and they'll be stomped on unless they do something.
Well, let's turn to, and you have a working hypothesis that for the reasons you gave, which are absolutely sound, Trump imminently goes ahead with all this. I predict that it might not be over by the time of the World Cup. The bombing may be over, but the reverberations of the bombing, just like the reverberations of the bombing of Baghdad, will rumble on for decades.
You're right. I mean, this is a historically pivotal moment that will last. If war is ignited, it will affect the rest of our lives, and it will be more devastating for the global economy, for our societies, than the invasion of Iraq, for sure. Let me just make one point about predictions. I'm not predicting at a 100% rate, an imminent attack on Iran. There might still be an off-ramp there, but the predators will come back because of the presence of Greater Israel and the desperation of Greater Israel. I pointed to an article in Israel's most popular newspaper, Yediot Aharonot, citing security sources, reporting that Israeli security officials are speaking to their American counterparts about the stakes here, and they are concerned that Iran has already reached military parity with Israel, and this is not acceptable. You know, the U.S. has this qualitative military edge policy where Israel must get more weapons and must receive more military support than any other regional, not even adversary, but even regional ally like Egypt. And now Iran is reaching parity with its ballistic missile program, and Israel it feels like it's in an existential moment. And if it does not destroy the Islamic Republic and completely degrade its military capacity, maybe balkanize Iran, plunge it into civil war as it did to Syria, then Israel is going to have to go to the table and negotiate with the axis of resistance. And that for them, they cannot allow that to happen. So I think whether it happens now or not, Israel will keep pushing and keep the destabilization coming. And as you said, George, it's not going to be a war that can be cleanly decided in a matter of weeks or even months. It could lead to civil war. It will involve all regional allies. Iran is saying this openly, that they will activate their allies in Ansar Allah in Yemen, Hezbollah, and elsewhere, the popular mobilization units in Iraq. It will be a regional war. It will involve attacks on shipping. They will attempt to close the Strait of Hormuz. And I think the only option that the Zionist axis of the US and Israel have for heading off that scenario is massive, massive force to prevent the closure of the Strait of Hormuz and completely neutralize Iran's retaliatory capacity in the first few days. And that might actually involve using tactical nuclear weapons, which would be unprecedented in the post-war period and would be destabilizing on its own.
Well, I think that's perfectly possible. And I think that's what Trump is constantly, darkly hinting at when he talks about unimaginable. You will not be able to imagine what we can do to you. Do you see any significance in the fact that Vice President Vance and Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard are reportedly opposed to this attack on Iran? And can they still prevail?
I'm sure Tulsi Gabbard's opposed to it based on her public statements going back years. J.D. Vance certainly not excited about it. And he's someone who has stated his opposition to it and confirmed last year, seated in the what was sort of the empty anchor chair of TPUSA's program at Real American Voice that used to belong to Charlie Kirk, that Charlie Kirk had been the only major movement figure to storm into the White House and tell Donald Trump, do not do this, do not support Israel's attack on Iran. Now, Charlie Kirk's dead. J.D. Vance is the vice president, but I don't think he's as influential on this policy as someone like Marco Rubio, whose career has been fueled with donations by not just the Adelsons, but also Paul Singer, another ultra-Zionist MAGA backer from Elliott Capital Management. Marco Rubio is playing a much more decisive role, and I think J.D. Vance is in the back seat. Tulsi Gabbard is not even in the room. As I reported last June, citing administration sources, Tulsi Gabbard was pushed out of briefings in which Trump was involved by Susie Wiles, the White House chief of staff. And who is Susie Wiles? She's someone who was actually hired by Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, as an advisor for his 2020 presidential prime ministerial campaign. So consider that. The White House chief of staff literally worked for Netanyahu and is keeping all the dissenters, the so-called Vance faction, out of the room. J.D. Vance was holding his own briefings at the time and including all voices. But it was really when Trump was in the room with John Ratcliffe, who was being briefed by the Mossad, Michael Kurilla at the time, he was the CENTCOM chief who was being briefed by the chief of staff of the Israeli Defense Forces. And Susie Wiles was keeping all the other voices out of the room. Now what are we seeing? Steve Witkoff, this is Fox News just reported this. Steve Witkoff, who doesn't hold any official role in the administration and is very tied to the Zionist movement, has actually publicly said that Iran could produce a nuclear weapon in 1 week. So straight up WMD style propaganda that Donald Trump is hearing. And I think he's very isolated there. And also I think he's personally anxious about his own security. As I said, I'll have a report about this out early this week. And, hopefully the region is not in flames by then.
Susie Wiles, of course, would appear to have been given the contract on Tucker Carlson to provide for the effective anathematization of Tucker Carlson and his abolition, basically, from a right-wing movement company. Now, Max, I almost daren't ask this last question. Where are the Democrats in all of this? Everything that we hear, certainly across the pond, is the different factions of MAGA, the different factions of the Trump movement. But is there anybody else in American politics? I mean, any leading figure had anything to say on this?
That's a great question. And it speaks to why it's been so easy for Donald Trump to mass so much force around the periphery of Iran without explaining anything to the American public or going to Congress. Because you have Chuck Schumer, who has called himself the shomer, using the Hebrew word for protector of Israel, as Senate Minority Leader. He just finished up a book tour on a book about anti-Semitism. Then you've got Speaker Emeritus Nancy Pelosi, who still commands massive influence over the House Democrats, declaring in a recent interview at the Munich Security Conference that the U.S. should use more economic power to destroy Iran's economy. And then you have AOC representing the progressive forces in Congress, at least as its most influential, popular face and voice, who polls very well among, social media savvy millennials and Gen Zers, who only yesterday brought herself to issue a statement against the war. Just a few words: no war with Iran. She didn't really explain why there should be no war. Nothing, no forceful rhetoric there. And then you could see that her advisors, specifically her advisor, Matt Duss, seized on this statement to make her qualify it and declare that actually the Democrats should be pushing for regime change in Iran and pushing for these, regime change riots more. And, she supports all of those measures. She just doesn't want to see a war. So she's being controlled by gatekeepers. And there are some principled voices among the Democrats who are doing the right thing, which is to force Trump to go to Congress. And they're teaming up with principled figures like Thomas Massie on the other side of the aisle. If Donald Trump does have to go to Congress, it's going to make this war a whole lot more complicated. And you can actually see that as pressure rises for him to go to Congress for a vote, to force the vote, there's more momentum for negotiations and for a deal with Iran. But as I said before, then you have this other force that can't be reined in called Greater Israel.
How do we, sorry, I said that was the last question, but it's tantalizing, Max, when I've got you here.
Yeah.
We've talked about the role of money, the Adelsons and the Singer and all the other big backers. And we've talked about the power of these evangelical, so-called Christian Zionist people like Huckabee. Is this state capture really all attributable to campaign donations and the political weight of the evangelicals, or, as well as cash, is it compromat? And has, in your view, it become clear enough that Epstein and maybe other Epsteins have gathered enough compromat on American politicians as to, added to the money and added to the evangelical factor, effectively given Israel and the Israel lobby really more or less complete control of the American political system?
I've always argued that the compromat or the compromising or blackmail is happening right in front of our faces. I mean, AIPAC created the CIA director, John Ratcliffe, as a member of Congress. They recruited him when he was a backbench, when he was actually a small town lawyer outside Dallas. And when he first ran for Congress, they came in and made sure he won, and they are responsible for his whole career. Same with Marco Rubio. Same with Mike Waltz, who's now the U.S. ambassador, but was the National Security Council director. I released the audio of the AIPAC director stating this in private that I obtained through a source. So that in some ways is compromat. They can just pull the plug on these figures if they want to. And the AIPAC new CEO, Elliot Brandt, he said, we have these lines now in the White House and we're going to call in these favors. Then you do have, Epstein, the Epstein saga. Netanyahu doesn't like this. The Israelis don't like it. They don't like that people see Epstein as someone who's connected to Israel and potentially was an asset of Israeli intelligence. They want it shut down. You can actually see kind of like their propagandists, their more elite boutique propagandists in the media who circle around these publications like Free Press, which was founded by Barry Weiss, or Compact Magazine, which seems to be funded by Peter Thiel, who was an Epstein associate. Bill Ackman is another figure who is tied to Epstein. They're really trying to shut this down and, poke holes in the whole narrative that Epstein was a sex trafficker. And it's not working. It just won't go away. Then you have Donald Trump. He's mentioned over 5,000 times in this latest January 30th tranche of over 3 million emails. But there's nothing particularly compromising there about Trump that I've seen yet. These photos we said we were going to see of Trump with, young girls on his lap and so on. Haven't seen those yet. So why is Trump behaving so strangely around Epstein? And why is he sought to prevent the release? Why does his FBI behave so strangely? It seems to me that Trump is protecting others who are close to him, who may have leverage over him for other reasons. And so I think this is much bigger than Epstein. And what we're seeing with Epstein and the Epstein class is symbolic of something much larger. It's what I would call the conspiracy of late stage capitalism. It essentially is, it's not an economic system that we're living under. We're living under a conspiracy of oligarchs, which defines the system. I can give an example of that. Jeffrey Epstein, I think, was introduced to so many of the influential people he met, including, I think, Prince Andrew, by Lady Lynn DeForester Rothschild. I might be getting this wrong, but he was a representative for the Rothschild family. And who is Lady Lynn DeForester Rothschild? She's been close to Hillary Clinton. She, used to be married to very important New York power brokers. Then she married a Rothschild. And she founded something in 2014 that very few people are aware of called the Conference on Inclusive Capitalism. I'm looking at a BBC report right now, and this is from 2014. Men and women who hold some 30 trillion of assets under management, that's 1/3 of the world's investable assets, will gather in London on Tuesday. The Prince of Wales gathered there, Bill Clinton, Christine Lagarde, who is heading the IMF, and Mark Carney, who was a Bank of England governor. Remember the Bank of England, which was basically founded by the Rothschilds. He's now the Premier of Canada. They were all gathered there by this woman who was being represented in so many ways by Epstein. So Epstein's about something so much bigger, and Trump is running cover for that system. And at the same time, I think he's very personally anxious about his security and his own family's security if he defies them, which he said he would do during his campaign.
And don't forget Lucky Lukenik, the Commerce Secretary.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. He turns out to have made billions on the failure of Trump's tariff policy to get through the Supreme Court. You couldn't make that up.
Well, that's a great point. I mean, Howard Lutnick is such a central figure in all this. He's someone who lied about his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein and actually was planning to go to Epstein Island after he said he broke all ties in 2005. Epstein's major investor, Les Wexner, along with Epstein, helped Lutnick move into the townhome on the other side of Epstein's wall. I mean, it was a historic townhome, and they arranged this sale through shell companies that they set up. Howard Lutnick is a deeply corrupt figure. That's his financial model, which is the financial model of the system under which we live, late-term capitalism. So Howard Lutnick set up, it looks like to many people in MAGA, that he set up the tariff policy to fail so he and his sons could cash in. He has a 26-year-old son who he has made CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald, his firm. And they gambled that the tariffs would fail, and so they get to profit on the tariff rebates. They've got their hands in so many different cookie jars, financial cookie jars. There's also the crypto policy. Trump is deregulating crypto, and Howard Lutnick is overseeing the deregulation of crypto. And at the same time, he has a $600 million investment, 5% of total assets, in the company that controls stablecoin. And that company, Tether, was moved to El Salvador under the Trump administration's watch to the country controlled by the crypto gulag master, Nayib Bukele, because crypto companies there pay zero taxes and face zero regulation. And then when he was accused of a conflict of interest, Howard Lutnick transferred control of that $600 million stake in Tether to guess who? His 26-year-old son, who he put in charge at Cantor Fitzgerald. The corruption is just staring us in the face, and it's at the same time, it's so vast and so overwhelming. Eric Trump just taking control of a publicly traded Israeli drone company that is going to claim record kills going forward. It's so vast and so over the top that it's impossible to keep track of. And I think many Americans have just thrown up their hands, or they're just throwing in the towel. They're like, I give up. We don't live in a democracy. Nothing's affordable. We can't fight back. And, there's this hopelessness that's prevailing.
No wonder Lutnick's always laughing, even when President Trump is talking about his stroke of luck in not going into work in the Twin Towers that fateful day on 9/11.